At 8:43 in the morning, on February 23, 1945, below the broken slopes of Mount Suribachi, a Sherman tank stopped in a field of black volcanic ash. The island was Iwo Jima. The tank belonged to a marine armor unit moving in short, ugly bursts across ground that did not behave like ground. The ash swallowed boots. It grabbed at tracks. It rose in dark clouds whenever steel touched it, coating faces, rifles, teeth, eyelids. Men who tried to run found themselves sinking. Men who tried to crawl found the earth moving beneath their elbows like powdered glass. Somewhere ahead, a Japanese bunker had come alive again. It had been hit already. Everyone believed it had been hit. Naval shells had torn the slope. Rockets had passed over it. Machine guns had raked the opening until the rocks around it looked chewed. For a few minutes it had gone quiet. Then the firing slit blinked. A burst of machine gun fire cut across the ash, low and flat, close enough that one Marine dropped his face into the ground and stayed there, breathing through dirt. Another man tried to pull a wounded rifleman by the collar, but every time he moved, the gun started again. Inside the Sherman, the crew could hear almost nothing clearly. The engine filled the hull with a heavy mechanical growl. Hot oil mixed with the smell of sweat, metal, powder smoke, and fuel. Somewhere above the noise, fragments snapped against the armor like handfuls of stones thrown at a steel door. The commander, half raised in the hatch, looked forward through smoke and dust and saw a Marine waving hard with one arm. Not words. No speech could survive in that noise. Just a hand, chopping toward the cave. The flame gunner waited. His view of the war was not the wide battlefield shown on maps. It was a narrow slit, a dark patch of rock, a flicker where enemy fire came from, a voice in the intercom, pressure gauge, a trigger. The Japanese defenders inside the bunker had trusted the mountain. They had trusted depth, concrete, rock, darkness, and discipline. They had been told that American firepower could be endured, that the shells would pass, that the invaders would have to come close, that courage from underground could bleed the Marines white. And for a while they were right. The bunker had done exactly what it was built to do. It had survived. But now something different was coming toward it. Not a rifleman with a portable tank on his back. Not a demolition man crawling with a satchel charge. Not another shell falling blind from the sky. A tank had carried fire to the mouth of the cave. The commander lowered his head into the turret and gave the order. The first burst rolled forward in a long, bright sheet, not like an explosion but like something alive, bending with the air, striking the bunker mouth and folding into it. The ash around the opening lit for a moment. Smoke thickened. The machine guns stopped. No one cheered. The Marines waited. That was the terrible part. After flame, there was always waiting. Waiting for another burst from inside. Waiting for a grenade. Waiting for a man on fire to stagger out. Waiting to learn whether the bunker was dead or only pretending again. They had believed the cave was protection. But what really happened was that the cave became a trap. And the Americans were only beginning to understand how much the Pacific War had changed when the safest place on an island could be reached by fire. Yet that morning did not begin with the tank. It began months earlier in Japanese planning rooms, in tunnel entrances, in the quiet conviction that American machines could be absorbed by stone. The fortress that was supposed to bleed America dry. By 1945, Japan no longer fought the island war the way it had fought in the early years. The lesson had been written in blood across the Pacific. On island after island, beach defenses had been smashed by naval guns, carrier aircraft, and the unbearable weight of American landing power. A line drawn too close to the water could be destroyed before it had the chance to kill. A soldier who charged too soon could die without changing the battle. A position exposed to the sky could vanish beneath shellfire. So the Japanese adapted. They moved inward. They moved downward. They made the island itself into a weapon. On Iwo Jima, General Tadamaki Kuribayashi understood the truth more clearly than many others. He could not stop the Americans from landing. Not permanently. Not with the forces he had. Not against the ships gathering off the horizon, the guns, the aircraft, the endless supplies crossing the ocean behind them. So he built a defense that did not depend on stopping the first wave. It depended on surviving it. Caves were expanded. Tunnels were cut through volcanic rock. Artillery was hidden behind slopes. Machine guns were placed where they could fire across approaches and then vanish into darkness. Mortars were dug in. Command posts were buried. Bunkers were connected so that a position that seemed silent could be reoccupied through another entrance. The defenders were not waiting in one line. They were waiting inside a system. To an American looking at the island from offshore, Iwo Jima seemed small, bare, ugly. A patch of volcanic ground with an airfield and a mountain at one end. To the Japanese defenders inside it, it was something else. A layered fortress built not to win in the ordinary sense, but to make victory so expensive that the attacker would remember every yard. There was a belief beneath the construction. American firepower was vast, but impatient. American soldiers were brave, but they needed movement. American commanders needed schedules, objectives, maps, and visible progress. The Japanese believed that if the battle could be slowed, broken into caves and ridges and blind corners, then the invader's strength could be turned into frustration. A battleship could fire at a hill, but it could not see a man breathing in a tunnel beneath it. A bomber could drop explosives, but it could not always collapse a chamber buried deep enough in rock. A Marine could take a ridge, but the ridge could begin shooting again after he passed. That was the cruel genius of the defense. It made the battlefield dishonest. Nothing stayed finished. A bunker that appeared destroyed in the morning might fire again in the afternoon. A cave sealed from one side might open from another. A dead slope might speak suddenly in machine gun fire. Japanese officers believed this kind of war would prove something. That material power had limits, that the American advance could be made to crawl, that the underground soldier could endure what the surface soldier could not. And there was logic in it. It was not madness. It was not simple fanaticism. It was military adaptation under impossible conditions. Japan could not match American production, could not replace losses at the same pace. It could not contest the sea in the way it once had. But it could dig, could hide, could force close combat. It could make the Americans pay in minutes, bodies, and nerve. The men inside those positions were told to hold. Not for rescue, not for counterattack, often not even for survival. Hold because delay itself had become a weapon. But a fortress built underground creates its own danger. It protects men from one kind of death while binding them to another. It narrows the world. It turns air into a resource. It makes every entrance a lifeline. And if the enemy discovers a way to put fire through that entrance, the place built for endurance begins to change its meaning. The Japanese believed the Americans would have to come in with flesh. What they had not fully measured was what would happen when the Americans came in with machines carrying flame. The American miscalculation. The Americans had studied the island. They had photographed it from the air. They had shelled it from the sea. They had marked targets, counted gun positions, studied beaches, and planned landing zones. Officers bent over maps and drew arrows across ground that looked simple when flattened onto paper. Red beach, yellow beach, blue beach, lines, timetables, objectives. A few days, some believed. Perhaps less resistance after bombardment. Perhaps the defenders would be shaken, stunned, disorganized. Perhaps the Marines, once ashore, would move quickly enough to break the island's spine. But maps do not show breathing tunnels. They do not show how a hill can be hollow. They do not show how long a man can sit in darkness after a shell lands above him, waiting for the noise to pass. Before the landings, American naval guns struck Iwo Jima with tremendous force. Aircraft bombed it. Rockets and shells tore into visible positions. From the ships, the island seemed to be disappearing behind smoke and flame. It was easy, from a distance, to believe destruction had done its work. Then the Marines went ashore. The first problem was the ground. The black ash did not give men footing. It slid beneath boots and collapsed under wheels. Foxholes were hard to dig because the ash would not hold shape. Vehicles bogged down. Supplies piled up on beaches under fire. Men carrying radios, ammunition, stretchers, and flamethrowers found themselves fighting the island before they even reached the enemy. Then the Japanese guns opened. Not all at once. Not in the way nervous men expected. The defense waited until the beaches were crowded, until targets gathered, until landing craft, tanks, infantry, and supplies were trapped in the same killing space. Then the island began to fire. Mortars, artillery, machine guns, anti-tank weapons. Positions that had supposedly been destroyed now revealed themselves with a kind of cold patience. The bombardment had damaged Iwo Jima, but it had not killed the system beneath it. This was the American miscalculation. Firepower could prepare the battlefield, could not always finish it. A bunker was not merely a shape on a map. It was a decision that had to be forced. Someone had to go close enough to make it stop forever. Someone had to crawl within throwing distance. Someone had to place a charge. Someone had to stand where the machine gun could find him. Someone had to look into the black opening and decide whether the silence was real. The Marines learned quickly that suppression and destruction were not the same thing. Suppression meant the gun was quiet. Destruction meant it would never fire again. Between those two words lay a terrible distance. On Iwo Jima, that distance was crossed by rifle squads, demolition teams, tanks, engineers, corpsmen, and men carrying flamethrowers. The official language would later speak of positions reduced, caves sealed, resistance eliminated. But on the ground, each phrase had weight. It meant a man had gone forward when every instinct told him to stay low. The Japanese had believed their underground defense would make the Americans spend lives for every position. They were right, but they also believed the Americans would remain trapped in one rhythm. Bombard, advance, bleed, repeat. That was the part that began to fail. American units were learning under fire. They were not always elegant. They were not always fast. But they were practical. If one method cost too much, they tried another. If infantry flamethrowers died too often, commanders looked for protection. If a bunker resisted shells, tanks were pushed closer. If a tank's cannon could not reach the interior, engineers asked whether flame could. War on Iwo Jima became a brutal argument between fixed belief and forced adaptation. The Japanese defense said, "Come closer." The American answer became, "We will, but not always on foot." And that answer depended first on the most exposed men on the battlefield. The men who had to walk into range. Before flame was mounted in armor, it was carried on men's backs. A portable flamethrower operator did not look like a hero from a distance. He looked burdened, awkward, too visible. The tanks on his back made him wider, heavier, easier to identify. He moved with weight pulling at his shoulders and hips, with hoses crossing his body, with a nozzle in his hands that made him one of the most dangerous men near the line, and one of the most hunted. Everyone understood what he carried. The Americans knew. The Japanese knew. The man himself knew most of all. To use a portable flamethrower, he had to get close. Close enough that the bunker was no longer an object on the horizon, but a black opening breathing smoke and bullets. Close enough to feel the ground jump from grenades. Close enough that a sniper, if he saw the tanks, would know exactly where to aim. There are weapons that allow distance. Artillery lets a man kill what he never sees. Naval guns turn map coordinates into explosions. Aircraft pass over a target and vanish. A flamethrower was intimate. It demanded approach. It demanded exposure. And in the Pacific, it demanded a strange kind of nerve. Not theatrical courage. Not shouting courage. The quieter kind. The kind that makes a man check a valve with trembling fingers and then move because the squad behind him cannot move unless he does. Imagine him in the ash. A Marine flamethrower operator lies beside a fold in the ground while bullets pass overhead. His assistant crawls close, trying to protect him, carrying extra gear or watching the flanks. Riflemen fire toward the bunker slit, not because they can see much, but because the gun must be kept down for a few seconds. A few seconds can be enough. A few seconds can also be too little. The operator waits for a signal. Perhaps an officer gestures. Perhaps a sergeant shouts. Perhaps no one gives a formal order at all, only the pressure of men wounded in front and men trapped behind. He rises. The weapon is heavy. The distance feels longer than it looked. If he fires too early, the flame may fall short. If he waits too long, the bunker may catch him first. There is no clean mathematics in that moment. There is training, fear, muscle, smoke, and luck. The Japanese defenders called such weapons cowardly in spirit because they did not fit older images of combat honor. Fire projected into a hole did not look like a fair contest between soldiers. It looked like punishment from outside reach. But the battlefield had already abandoned fairness. A machine gun firing from a slit into men trapped in ash was not a duel either. A cave system designed to reawaken after bombardment was not an open fight. Both sides were using what the conditions allowed. The American flamethrower operator was not carrying cowardice. He was carrying the answer to a place rifles could not enter. But the cost was severe. Flamethrower men drew fire. They were burdened by equipment. Their weapons had limited duration. Their range, compared with a tank-mounted system, could be painfully short. And when a portable flamethrower failed, jammed, ran dry, or missed, the man holding it could not simply reverse away behind armor. He was there in the open. The Marines needed flame. But they needed a way to stop spending the men who carried it. Somewhere behind the lines, in workshops and supply areas, another idea was taking shape. It was ugly. It was dangerous. It sounded almost foolish when reduced to a sentence. Put the flamethrower inside a tank. Put hell inside a Sherman. A Sherman tank was already a crowded machine. It had been built around steel, ammunition, movement, optics, radios, cramped crew stations, and the hard logic of armored warfare. Men inside it worked shoulder to shoulder with noise and heat. Every inch mattered. Every modification had consequences. So the idea of adding a flamethrower was not simple. It meant tanks of fuel, pressure systems, hoses, valves, ignition, extra maintenance, training, safety problems. It meant asking crews to climb into a vehicle that did not merely carry shells and gasoline, but a weapon whose entire purpose was to project burning fuel into places men could not reach. On paper, it could look crude. In practice, it required serious work. Engineers, mechanics, Seabees, chemical warfare service personnel, and marine armor specialists all became part of the answer. They were not the men who would appear in paintings. They were not usually the names remembered by casual histories. They worked around machinery, fittings, pumps, tanks, pressure gauges, and the stubborn fact that a weapon built too neatly for a proving ground might fail in coral dust, ash, mud, salt air, and enemy fire. The Pacific did not forgive delicate equipment. A flame tank had to start when needed. It had to fire when the infantry was waiting. It had to move over bad ground. It had to survive small arms fire, fragments, and close assault. It had to work after the crew had been awake too long and after mechanics had repaired it with whatever parts were available. No one needed a perfect weapon. They needed one that worked at the bunker mouth. The Sherman gave the flamethrower something the man on foot did not have: armor, fuel capacity, mechanical power, and the ability to approach while absorbing punishment that would cut down infantry. The flame projector could be mounted in different ways depending on the model and conversion. Some systems replaced or supplemented existing weapons. Others were improvised through field modification. Verify specific model details for the selected campaign. M4A3R3, POA, CWS, H1, CB, H1, CB, H2. But the essential idea remained brutally clear. A protected crew could carry flame farther, longer, and closer to the problem. There was still danger. More than enough. Japanese defenders learned to attack tanks with mines, explosive charges, anti-tank guns, and close-in assault teams. Terrain could immobilize armor. A broken track could turn a tank into a fixed target. A blind approach could expose its flank. Infantry still had to protect it, guide it, and follow behind it. The tank did not replace men. It needed them around it. The relationship between infantry and armor in the Pacific was intimate and tense. A tank crew could not see what a Marine crawling 10 yards away could see. A rifleman could not survive in the open without the tank's gun, armor, and flame. Hand signals mattered. Trust mattered. A misunderstanding could kill both. The Japanese believed machines could not solve the moral force of hidden defenders willing to die. The Americans discovered something colder. A machine did not need to solve morale. It only needed to reach the opening. The first time a flamethrower tank moved toward a live bunker, no one knew whether the idea would work the way reports promised. The crew had theories. The infantry had hope. The defenders had stone around them. Then the tank went forward. First fire under fire. The tank did not glide into battle. It lurched. That is the part clean diagrams leave out. A tank in the Pacific did not move across a neat training field. It climbed through broken ground, shell holes, ash, coral, stumps, debris, mines, and the remains of positions already fought over. Its driver saw only fragments of the world. Its commander had to expose himself to understand what was happening. Its gunner waited for targets that appeared and vanished like tricks of light. Around it moved infantrymen who looked small beside the armor, but without them the tank was half blind. A Marine ahead pointed toward a ridge. Another man lay flat and waved the tank left. A third fired into a dark slit not because he expected to kill the gunner inside, but because the Japanese defender had to keep his head down for the tank to close the last yards. Those last yards mattered most. Too far away, the flame might not enter deeply enough. Too close, the tank risked mines, charges, or a suicidal close assault. The commander had to judge distance through smoke, dust, and fear. The driver had to keep moving even when metal struck the hull. The flame gunner had to wait until the opening filled his narrow world. Inside the bunker, Japanese soldiers heard the tank before they fully saw it. Engines carried through rock differently than voices. A shell burst was brief. Machine gun fire had rhythm. But a tank approaching a cave had weight. Came closer in vibrations. The ground told the defenders something heavy was outside. Perhaps they had faced tanks before. Perhaps they believed the bunker would hold. A cannon shell might strike the exterior. A machine gun might rake the slit. Infantry might try to rush and die. The position had been designed for those things. Then the flame came. A tank-mounted burst did not behave like ordinary fire. It crossed distance in a violent stream, struck the entrance, and entered where bullets could not turn corners. It consumed oxygen. It filled the opening with heat, smoke, pressure, and panic. It turned the architecture of survival into a passage for destruction. Outside, the Marines watched for signs. A bunker under flame could go silent too quickly, and silence could not always be trusted. Japanese defenders had already taught them that. A quiet position might still contain men with grenades. A cave mouth might be empty while another exit opened behind the line. A tunnel might carry survivors into a new firing point. So the tank fired again. Then demolition men moved. Riflemen advanced. Grenades went in. Satchel charges followed. The flame tank was not magic. It was part of a grim sequence, a combined method for solving a problem that no single weapon could solve cleanly. But something had changed. The Americans had found a way to make the defender's strongest place vulnerable at the point where it touched the outside world. The bunker had been built to resist impact. It had not been built to breathe fire. In the reports that followed, the language would become spare. Position neutralized, cave reduced, resistance overcome. But the men nearby understood it differently. They had seen a machine gun that had pinned them for hours fall quiet after a few seconds of flame. They had watched a place that seemed impossible suddenly become passable. That kind of lesson spreads quickly in battle. So does fear. Because once the Japanese understood what the flame tank could do, every engine sound near a cave carried a new meaning. When the bunkers began falling, a bunker does not fall like a building. It falls first in confidence. For Japanese defenders, the underground system was more than concrete and rock. It was a promise. If the surface was destroyed, they could endure. If the beach was lost, they could continue. If the hill was shelled, they could wait inside it. Their bodies might be hungry, exhausted, thirsty, burned by heat and smoke, but the position itself gave them the one thing every defender needs, a belief that staying still matters. Flamethrower tanks attacked that belief, not by killing everyone at once. That was never guaranteed. not by making the battle easy. Nothing on Iwo Jima or Okinawa was easy. The tanks broke belief because they made the cave uncertain. They made the bunker feel temporary. They meant that even a position protected from shells could be reached through its entrance, its firing slit, its vent, or the narrow seam where darkness met air. The Japanese had expected Americans to come close. They had counted on it. Close range favored defenders who knew the ground. It allowed grenades, rifles, machine guns, mortars, and interlocking fire to do their work. The closer the Marines came on foot, the more the island could consume them. But a flamethrower tank changed the shape of close range. It allowed the Americans to come close behind steel. Not invulnerably, not without fear, but close enough to turn the defender's protected angle against him. The cave mouth, once a shielded firing point, became a point of entry for heat. The tunnel, once a route of survival, could carry smoke. The chamber, once hidden from naval guns, could become a sealed place where breath itself became difficult. There were Japanese soldiers who stayed and died. There were others who moved deeper. Some positions had to be attacked again and again. Some were sealed rather than cleared. Some defenders emerged only after the battle had passed, confused, wounded, or unwilling to believe the island was lost. The battlefield did not change all at once. It changed bunker by bunker. A ridge that took hours. A cave that cost a squad. A tank that fired until its fuel was gone. A crew that backed away to reload while another tank moved forward. A Marine officer marking the map not with grand arrows now, but with small corrections. This cave sealed, this pillbox active, this draw still dangerous. That was the truth hidden beneath the dramatic image of flame. The weapon's real power was not spectacle. It was accumulation. Every bunker reduced meant a few more yards. Every firing slit silenced meant a stretcher team could move. Every cave mouth sealed meant a platoon might sleep for 20 minutes without that gun waking again. In a campaign where progress could be measured in yards, a weapon that saved minutes under fire could save lives. But the cost did not disappear. It moved. The men inside the tank absorbed fear instead of the men outside it. The Japanese inside the bunkers suffered in ways that even hardened soldiers struggled to describe. Infantry following behind saw what flame left behind. Corpsmen treated burns. Marines who had begged for the tank's help sometimes turned away after it worked. The Japanese had called such weapons cowardly because they seemed to kill without personal contest. But the Pacific War had already destroyed the old image of contest. A hidden machine gun firing into wounded men was not noble. A cave defense designed for death without surrender was not gentle. A flamethrower tank was not clean. It was the product of a battlefield where every clean idea had already failed. The bunkers began falling, but each one left behind a question the reports could not answer. What kind of victory requires fire to enter the earth? The mathematics of survival. Numbers in war can sound cold. Too cold. Ranges. Casualties. Fuel capacity. Minutes. Yards. Armor thickness. Number of tanks available. Number of bunkers remaining. On paper, they seemed to remove the human being from the battlefield. But on Iwo Jima, numbers were not abstract. They were the distance between a living Marine and a machine gun slit. They were the number of seconds a flamethrower operator could stand before someone found him. They were the number of yards a Sherman could cross before a mine broke its track. They were the number of bursts left in the tank before it had to withdraw. A portable flamethrower had limits. Its operator had to approach dangerously close, and its fuel supply did not last long. Reports and manuals differ by model and conditions, but the important truth is not only the exact range. It is what the range meant. A man on foot had to spend his own body to bring flame forward. A tank-mounted system changed that equation. Carried more fuel. It offered protection. It could fire from farther away depending on the system. It could survive fragments and rifle fire that would kill an exposed operator. Could reposition under fire. It could support several assaults before needing to withdraw. That did not make it safe. It made it less impossible. The difference between impossible and less impossible was where men lived. Consider a single bunker holding up a company. Not an entire army. Not a campaign. Just one bunker, well-placed, with a machine gun and enough concealment to survive bombardment. Every minute it remains active, men are pinned. A corpsman cannot reach the wounded. Platoon cannot advance. Another unit cannot move because its flank is exposed. Mortars adjust. Snipers wait. Heat, thirst, and fear do their work. Now add a flamethrower tank. If it can reach firing distance, if the infantry can protect it, if the ground does not stop it, if the weapon functions, the bunker may be reduced in seconds or minutes instead of hours. That is the mathematics of survival. Not a clean equation, but a brutal compression of exposure time. Less time under fire. Fewer men crawling forward with charges. Fewer portable operators standing in the open. Fewer repeated assaults into the same killing lane. What matters is not that the tank always worked. It did not. What matters is what happened when it did. American commanders who watched the results did not need moral language to understand them. The infantry moved after flame. Positions stopped firing. Bunkers that had consumed riflemen could be approached. Reports began to recognize what frontline men already knew. In the cave war, mechanized flame was not a luxury. It was a tool shaped by necessity. But every number hid a face. The tank crew counted fuel, pressure, range, and angle. The infantry counted yards to the next cover. The wounded counted breaths. The Japanese defenders counted grenades, water, ammunition, and the time between American attacks. War reduced them all. That is one of its quietest cruelties. A man becomes a silhouette in a firing slit. A cave becomes a target number. A tank becomes a call sign on a radio. A dead Marine becomes a line in a casualty report. A Japanese defender sealed underground becomes part of an objective marked complete. The flame tank made survival more likely for some men by making survival nearly impossible for others. And inside the Sherman, the men who carried that power were not distant from it. They were sealed beside fuel and steel, listening to the island strike back. Inside the steel box, inside the tank, courage did not feel like courage. Felt like heat. Felt like stale air and sweat running under a helmet. It felt like the vibration of the engine traveling through the bones. It felt like the metal floor under boots, the hard edge of equipment against ribs, the smell of fuel where no man wanted to smell fuel. A flamethrower tank crew lived inside contradiction. They were protected but trapped. They carried a weapon the infantry needed, but every Japanese defender understood its value and wanted it destroyed. They had armor around them, but armor could become a coffin if the track broke or the engine stalled. They had power but limited vision. They could kill a bunker, but they depended on riflemen outside to tell them where the bunker was. The commander's world was fragments. A hand signal, a shouted warning lost in engine noise, a burst of tracer, a Marine pointing from behind a rock, a shadow that might be an entrance, a slope that looked passable until the tank began to slide. Smoke thick enough to hide both enemy and friend. He had to decide anyway. The driver waited for instructions that often came late because the commander had to see first. The flame gunner waited for the opening. The radio operator listened through static and clipped voices. Someone inside checked pressure. Someone thought about how much fuel remained. Someone heard a sharp impact on the hull and did not know whether it mattered. Outside, Japanese soldiers moved in ways tank crews feared most. Close, low. From holes, trenches, folds in ground, behind rocks. A man with an explosive charge did not need to destroy a tank elegantly. He only needed to immobilize it, blind it, burn it, or make the crew abandon it. In the Pacific, tanks often required infantry protection not as a formality, but as survival. The tank and the foot soldier were bound together. The infantry hated being pinned without armor. The tank hated being blind without infantry. Neither could do the work alone. When the flame burst fired, the crew might not see its full effect. They might see light reflected in smoke. They might feel the weapon discharge through the vehicle. They might hear the commander call correction. The men outside saw more, sometimes too much. There was no heroic distance in this work. A bomber crew could tell itself the target was below cloud. A battleship crew could fire at coordinates beyond sight. But a flame tank operated at the edge of human recognition. The crew knew the cave was occupied. The defenders knew the tank had come for them. The infantry knew what would happen when the order was given. That closeness left marks. Some men spoke later in practical language because practical language was safer. The tank worked. The bunker was reduced. The position was taken. The advance continued. Other things remained unsaid. The Japanese defenders inside those bunkers were not abstractions. Many were young. Many were hungry. Many were frightened. Many had been ordered into a system that allowed little space for surrender. Some believed death in place was duty. Some may have wanted to live and found no path left open. The Americans outside were not abstractions either. They had seen friends shot from holes that would not stay dead. They had carried wounded men across ash. They had watched portable flamethrower operators fall before firing. They did not ask for a beautiful weapon. They asked for one that could end the gun. Inside the steel box, no one had the luxury of innocence. The flame tank was necessary because the battlefield had become a place where necessity and horror stood side by side, close enough to share the same breath. And when the bunker finally fell, the men still had to move past it. That was when victory became hardest to look at. The cost beneath the victory. After a bunker was taken, the battlefield did not become quiet. Changed sounds. The sharpness of gunfire gave way to smaller noises. Men calling for corpsmen, tracks clanking as the tank reversed, shovels striking rock, wounded men breathing through clenched teeth, someone coughing from smoke that would not leave his lungs. The dead were often not visible at first. In the Pacific, death hid in holes. It lay inside caves, behind collapsed entrances, beneath burned timber, under rock, under ash. A position could be marked cleared while its interior remained unseen. A Marine might sit down beside a tank and only then realize his hands were shaking. Another might ask for water and drink without removing his eyes from the cave. Victory at that scale did not feel large. Felt like a few yards. A little more ground from which the next bunker could kill you. The flamethrower tank saved lives. That must be said plainly. Men who might have been ordered to rush a firing slit instead waited behind armor. Demolition teams could move after flame had forced silence. Rifle squads could cross ground that had been impossible minutes earlier. Corpsmen could reach men who had been lying under fire. But it also killed terribly. There is no honest way to speak of the weapon without holding both truths at once. Fire in a confined space is not only heat. It is oxygen vanishing. It is smoke filling the throat. It is panic moving faster than thought. For defenders in caves and bunkers, the position that had promised survival could become a chamber with no good exit. Some died in flame, some in smoke, some by grenades and charges that followed. Some were sealed inside when clearing a position fully would have cost more lives. For American infantry, this reality did not always bring satisfaction. There were men who hated the weapon and still called for it. There were men who turned away and still knew it had saved them. There were men who understood that without it, they might have had to crawl forward themselves. That is the moral weight the documentary must not flatten. The Japanese called flamethrower tanks cowardly because they seemed to deny the defender a soldier's contest. But the men in the bunkers were part of a system that also denied ordinary contest. Hidden guns, interlocking fire, no surrender, underground reoccupation, wounded men shot down in ash. The island had already moved beyond any simple code of fairness. War often does that. It forces men to condemn the enemy's method while depending on their own. On Okinawa, the moral burden grew even heavier because civilians were trapped within the same landscape of caves, bombardment, fear, and military control. Any weapon used against underground positions carried the risk of entering spaces where not everyone was a combatant. Verify specific civilian cave incidents and unit records before final production. The Pacific War had become a place where military necessity moved through human shelter, and the line between fortress and refuge could be tragically thin. By the time official reports were written, the language had hardened. Positions were reduced. Resistance was eliminated. Strong points were neutralized. Such words are useful. Armies need them. Reports cannot carry every smell, every scream, every silence after flame. But the words also hide something. They make the work seem cleaner than it was. The men who were there knew better. They knew the tank had mattered. They knew the bunker had fallen. They also knew that falling bunkers did not end the cost. They only moved the cost forward, to the next ridge, the next cave, the next dark opening waiting beyond the smoke. And still, the reports began to change. Because even institutions that avoid ugly truths eventually recognize results. Recognition in the language of reports. Armies do not always admit lessons quickly. At first, a new weapon can be treated as a supplement, an experiment, a field adjustment, something useful under special conditions. Commanders may hesitate. Supply officers may worry. Mechanics may complain, often with reason. Crews may need training. Infantry may need to learn how to move with it. A weapon that looks decisive in one action can fail in another if terrain, coordination, or maintenance breaks down. But repeated battlefield experience has a way of stripping away preference. On the islands, the pattern became difficult to ignore. Where bunkers survived bombardment, flame tanks could help reduce them. Where infantry attacks stalled, armored flame could change the tempo. Where portable flamethrower operators were too exposed, tanks could carry the weapon forward with better protection. Where cave systems turned every approach into a trap, mechanized flame offered one of the few ways to reach inside without immediately spending more men. Reports began to reflect what frontline Marines and soldiers already felt. The tone was not poetic. It was practical, effective against caves, valuable against pillboxes, essential in reducing strong points, needed in greater numbers, worth protecting, worth maintaining, worth improving. That is how recognition often comes in war. Not with applause, with requisitions, with modifications, with commanders asking for more of what they once considered specialized, with mechanics working late because a tank had to be ready by morning, with infantrymen waiting for the sound of a particular engine before moving again. The flamethrower tank became part of a system of assault. Infantry, armor, demolitions, artillery, naval gunfire, air support, engineers, and medical evacuation. It did not replace any of them. It made certain impossible moments slightly more possible. But official recognition did not mean the men who built, drove, repaired, and guided these tanks became famous. Many remained names in unit records. Some vanished into the larger story of the Pacific. A few decorated men came to represent the courage of flamethrower assault, especially portable operators whose actions were visible and personal. But the mechanics who solved pressure problems, the crews who entered burning ground, the riflemen who protected the tank's blind sides, the corpsmen who treated the aftermath, many stayed in the background. That fits the nature of the weapon. It was not clean enough for easy legend. It was too useful to ignore and too terrible to celebrate. By the summer of 1945, with the planned invasion of Japan looming in military imagination, the lessons of Iwo Jima and Okinawa had weight. If the home islands had been invaded, caves, prepared positions, tunnels, and fortified terrain would likely have made flame weapons even more central. Verify planning documents related to Operation Downfall and projected flame tank use. The war ended before that final test arrived. But the idea had already crossed a threshold. The Americans had entered the Pacific believing that firepower, courage, and industrial strength could solve resistance through overwhelming force. The Japanese had entered their final island defenses believing that underground endurance could absorb that force and make victory unbearable. Both beliefs were incomplete. The battlefield produced something harsher. It showed that endurance could delay almost anything, but not everything. It showed that firepower from a distance could fail, but fire carried close behind armor could alter the fight. It showed that a weapon dismissed as cruel or dishonorable could become, in the eyes of the men pinned down by hidden guns, the only thing left to try. And after the reports were filed, after the maps were redrawn, after the bunkers were counted and the casualties recorded, the island remained. Quiet, scarred, full of places where belief had met reality underground. What fire revealed. Returned to the tank in the ash. The engine still running. The commander still watching the bunker mouth. The infantry still low behind the broken ground, waiting to learn whether silence means safety or deception. The pressure gauge has fallen. The air is thick. The flame gunner's hands are damp inside the steel hull. Outside, the volcanic ash holds every mark badly. Boot prints, track marks, blood, spent casings. The drag trail of a wounded man pulled backward by his collar. A few minutes earlier, that bunker was a fact. Now it is a question. That is what the flame tank did in the Pacific. It turned the most stubborn facts of Japanese defense into questions. Would the cave hold? Would the bunker survive? Would underground endurance still be enough if the attacker could bring fire directly to the opening? Sometimes the answer was yes for a while. Often it was no. But the truth is not that flamethrower tanks won the island war alone. They did not. No single weapon did. The Pacific was won by ships, aircraft, submarines, infantry, engineers, artillery, medics, supply crews, codebreakers, mechanics, and the vast industrial muscle behind them. It was also shaped by Japanese soldiers who fought from impossible positions with a discipline that made every American success costly. The flame tank was one piece of that larger machine. But it revealed something important. It revealed that bravery without adaptation could become slaughter. It revealed that fortification without air and movement could become imprisonment. It revealed that the weapon a commander dislikes in theory may become the weapon a platoon prays for under fire. It revealed that war does not preserve the moral categories men carry into it. It grinds them down. It asks what works, what fails, who pays, and how many times the same mistake will be repeated before someone changes the method. The Japanese defenders had believed caves, tunnels, and bunkers could turn American strength into exhaustion. For a time, they did. The Americans had believed bombardment and standard assault could break those defenses quickly. Often, they could not. What really happened was uglier and more human. Men under fire adapted. Mechanics modified machines. Tank crews entered ground no sane man wanted to cross. Infantrymen learned to trust steel they could not fully see through. Defenders who believed the earth would protect them discovered too late that every fortress needs an opening. And through that opening came fire. Not clean, not glorious, not invincible, but real. They believed the bunker was the answer to American power. But what really happened was that American power learned to crawl up to the bunker mouth, wrapped in armor, carrying flame. And in war, once reality reaches the door, belief has nowhere left to hide. If you watch this story to the end, share where you are watching from. And if someone in your family served in the war in any uniform on any front, you are welcome to leave their name in the comments so they are not forgotten. For more stories about what soldiers believed and what the battlefield forced them to learn, subscribe to WW2 Warfront. History is often remembered through the largest battles. But sometimes, the truth is found in the small, dark places where men had to decide what came next.